All right, what's up, my fully armed friends? Welcome back. Today's episode is going to be part 2. I think this is, if I remember correctly, the first part 2. This is going to be myself with Aubrey McGowan and Dr. Mark Janzen, who is the archaeologist at David Lipscomb. Actually, I think it's called Lipscomb University now. And when we met before, we kind of introduced ourselves to Aubrey and Mark, Dr. Mark, and we kind of left it hanging that we were going to get back together and talk about Exodus. And so that's exactly what we do today, because that's his specialty is Egyptology, and I think he's dug into the book of Exodus, and we cover a lot of interesting ground here. So I hope you guys enjoy this. We also kind of tee it up to talk about the Ark of the Covenant maybe on part 3, so we'll see how that goes. But I hope you guys enjoy this. If you do, don't forget to click the subscribe button, click the like button, pass this along to your friends, and make sure we get the word out. This is Dr. Mark Janzen and my buddy Aubrey McGowan on Fully Armed.
Welcome to the Fully Armed Podcast with Chris Hennessy. You got your armor on?
Hey, y'all.
Hey, man.
We're back.
We are.
This is a big moment because now while you have been here before, this is really the first repeat of part 2.
Okay.
Yeah, man.
So this is it. So we got a lot riding on this. We can't mess it up.
It'll be good.
Great. No pressure, man.
So Dr.
No
Mark
pressure.
Janzen, Professor Aubrey McGowan is back with us again. I think all the stuff's running. Last time you guys were here, we had a bit of a technical difficulty, but we plowed through.
We did.
It
actually turned out all right, man. I mean,
I
wasn't
thought so.
It wasn't your, 5 stars, but as far as but hey, man, it turned out good.
I fell back to, I think it was in Luke, right? One of the chapters where he says, "No man having put his hands on the plow then looks back is fit for the kingdom of heaven." And it's
That's good, man.
Well, I ain't going to look back. We're just going to keep plowing.
I can't do it twice.
So we threatened the last time that you were with us.
Yeah, we did.
Threatened that
We
were
lobbed
gonna,
the grenade.
the last time we did. The last time that Dr. Mark was with us, we threatened to find out how many wagon wheels are at the bottom
Of the Red Sea.
of the Red Sea.
None.
Yeah, man.
What?
Come on, man.
Shocking.
I can't remember who all I tell what sometimes, but did I go into the story that I had with my dad
No.
on that
man.
whole
But-
chariot wheel at the bottom
But
of
to
the
put it
sea
into
thing?
perspective,
Yeah.
last time we talked, we discussed that you're, in archaeology, you're professor of archaeology, and we talked a lot about your background, but then we did threaten we were going to talk about Exodus because
That's
that's,
right.
Yeah.
your,
Yes.
So
That's
yeah,
your wheelhouse.
that's your, I see what you did
did
there.
you see that? Oh,
Terrible.
yeah. Illinois Jansen.
Yeah, they've got to get you
Oh,
out
there
of
is that. I forgot about that.
There was Indiana
Man.
Jones, but now it's Illinois Jansen.
We are taking up valuable, important time. You and I.
I'm sorry.
Go. Tell me
All
about
right.
your dad.
So I was getting my MA at the time still, and it was like, I was like, my hometown was maybe 2.5, 3 hours away, so I'd go home periodically, right? It was easy drive, and he'd just gotten a DVD at church, right? It's like, what year would it have been? Like 2004 or so.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to watch it with him, and it was about the chariot wheel, well, the not actual chariot wheel, the bottom of the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba, which, spoiler alert, that's also the wrong side of the Sinai Peninsula. At any rate, so I'm watching it. I'm just like, man, there's no way. I mean, I'm not a professor yet, right? I'm still a student.
04, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So I'm getting my MA. 04 or 05, I can't remember which year. I just know in my life it's the chunks of where I'm at for school and then work.
I
know
get
what
it,
I mean?
yeah.
But it's one of those years, and we're going back and forth after it. I'm like, well, Dad, it's pretty corny, and no archaeologist would agree with this, and you can tell that because I don't actually interview any experts where the tagline after their name is associated with any school you've ever heard of, right? It's
Right.
all because you can kind of tell some of this even without being an expert.
Yeah.
And he's just not having it, right? Like,
Yeah.
he bought his $20 DVD at church,
Yeah.
Yeah,
well-meaning at least on the pastor's end. I don't know about the guy selling it.
Right.
And I said to him, he's helping with school and stuff. And I was like, Dad, you can either believe the guy that just got $20 off of you, or the son that you've spent thousands on his education. He's like, it is a bad investment. That's how I swayed him.
How about
I
that?
never got him convinced with any actual argumentation beyond that. I hit him where it hurts, though.
But a lot in the pocket.
Yeah.
But not a lot. So much has changed since 2004 to now, as far as there being a lot of information floating around out there in the world.
Yeah.
So we talked last time about respecting the experts.
Yeah.
And the experts who analyze the Exodus basically go into two camps. You have your biblical scholars and then your archaeologists / Egyptologists.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of overlap, though. And the Egyptologists / archaeologists who actually will look at the Exodus won't put it anywhere but, won't put Mount Sinai, let me be clear, anywhere but southern Sinai Peninsula.
Right.
They won't put it in Saudi Arabia. They won't put it somewhere to the north. The scholars either think there's no Exodus, there's not enough direct evidence, or they put Mount Sinai in southern Sinai. So when you watch something online or read a blog or whatever, and they've got you all the way over in Arabia, it doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
That's the armchair. I can't even call them archaeologists, right? That's people like Ron Wyatt, who was a nurse anesthetist.
Yeah, we talked about him last
just
time.
reminding kind of the audience a little bit. And there's a cleft in the rock. Moses hid in the cleft. You can do that with every mountain in that region. They've all got that stuff. Better is to understand the place names listed in the book of Exodus, 12 and 13 mostly, the chapters, and in Numbers, and find out what the route would be based on the sequence the Bible gives us, plus how long an ancient can realistically travel in a day.
Yeah.
There are studies on that with certain qualifiers, right? A lot of the studies are looking at like how long could a courier take a message. Okay, well, what era do they have a horse?
Right.
And then the Exodus is
how long can
the whole
tens
population,
of hundreds of thousands of people
or however
travel?
many.
Yeah.
Yep. So you end up taking the number down a bit because it's a larger group with the whole range of a population. But you end up thinking tops is like 15-ish miles a day.
Yeah.
And of course, topography, water sources, how much elevation is there, all that's going to give you some wiggle room there. And you don't have enough time to get all the way over to Arabia either.
Right.
So though we don't have direct physical evidence, we don't have like Moses was here on a rock kind of stuff, we do have ways to to contextualize the account and to try to understand how this would have sequentially happened.
Yeah.
And the Bible does intend to give us those details for a reason, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is Dr. Mark Janzen, where do you land on it? What's your hypothesis?
On if there is an Exodus?
Yeah,
Okay.
and kind of
So there's a lot of...
where does that
Hey,
route?
hold on. To put it into perspective, when we're talking about Exodus, just to lay it out there, Moses, Israel being led from Egypt into the Promised Land,
Right.
Via the wilderness.
through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, Mount Sinai being
Yep.
a very intent part of Exodus, where he goes and speaks with God and etc.
Yep.
So
this could be the longest answer in your podcast history. If
Perfect.
you want, I could just talk the whole day.
The 10 commandments.
I'm interested, man, because a lot of us have gathered a lot of our information from, of course, the Bible, but then also from online stuff.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. Or reading extra, material, but it's really interesting to hear the perspective of somebody who's literally, not necessarily saying devoted your life, but you devoted,
Your
a
professional
large
career,
part of your professional career.
And the
to
Exodus
it.
is a big part of what I study.
Yeah.
Having put together the book 5 Views on the Exodus, and just publishing on it several different places. The main thing I would want to communicate right off the bat here is I do think there's a historical Exodus, because the tradition is so important to the Israelites. I don't think they would be making the whole thing up. But we do have to get out in front of the nature of the evidence. I know that sounds nerdy and boring, but what I tend to see among people who don't specialize in this is they have too high expectations for what kind of evidence we can get.
Yeah.
And so that gets you into two problems. One, you're like, oh, well, there isn't one. I don't have enough evidence. Or you do hokey stuff like look for chariot wheels in the wrong sea.
And just to put it in perspective, what kind of time frame are we talking about? Because we're talking about, in your estimation, how many years since this is?
Well, so the date of the Exodus is another huge debate. So
that's a whole nother conversation.
We'll get to it. How about that?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay,
good deal.
First, we want to establish that there was one.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what my mentor, Jim Hoffmeyer, James in print, but what he told me, he's the same scholar I'd had that got me into all this, who was the only one I'd had when I was doing my debate with my dad.
Yeah.
He thought his dad for that debate. Wonderful guy. And he said, look, anybody who's debating the date with you is already in the same side when it comes to there being an Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
right.
gotcha.
So it's like a secondary.
Oh, I got
debate.
you.
I do think it's important.
Right.
But the reason I think there's an Exodus comes down to not direct physical evidence. I wish we had that. It would be less of a debate.
Yeah.
By which we mean things like, hey, this is the Israelite settlement in Egypt or something, which we do not have.
Right.
And there might be good reasons for that. But for now, we don't have that kind of stuff. Sinai hasn't really been subjected to actual archaeological excavations.
Mm.
There's been surveys, we call them, where you basically walk around and look to see if there would be potsherds and other things on the surface or sources of water that you might think, hey, we should try to dig here. But because of politics and funding, always kind of the elephants in the room for us in that part of the world, it really hasn't been excavated. And that's important for people to know, because when the people say there's no evidence of the Israelites in Sinai, you're like, yeah, but that's because we don't really have any evidence at all.
Because we haven't gotten permission.
We've done surveys, but not major excavations.
Yeah.
So all that's a really important kind of caveat. What we have instead is what I would call circumstantial evidence, and it's just what it sounds like. It's evidence that requires a circumstance to explain its existence. And what we end up usually doing there is we don't have definitive proof. Sometimes I think that's even theologically by design.
Right.
Because where would faith be?
Right.
Yeah.
Instead, we can talk about plausibility or the best explanatory power. Like, what theory has the best explanatory power? Like, what explains that circumstantial evidence best? So for me, one of my favorite things to point out here is the cluster of loan words that are Egyptian words borrowed in the Hebrew during the narration of Moses' birth, especially.
Oh, wow.
So words for basket, for rush or reed, for the shore. There's like 6 of them. And they're all mundane words. That, like, everybody would have known the word Pharaoh.
Right.
Or Ra or something. But how do the Israelite authors know the Egyptian word for reed, basket, or something like that if they never were there? It's not the kind of knowledge that you'd be familiar with just because you traded with them or whatever. I mean, it's like, that's pretty interesting that they're using some of the Egyptian words in their account.
Yeah.
And loanwords are a thing cultures do when they're in close enough contact over.
It's kind of like what we call Spanglish or whatever. You know, you've got
taco.
Yeah.
Right? We just use the word taco and everybody knows what it means. It's not an actual English term initially.
Yeah.
But it is evidence of a mixing and
and so then the question is,
cultures.
okay, would they have done that? Could they have done that later, or is that because they were in Egypt for a while? Right? And so that's why it's circumstantial. It's not definitive because you could have other theories for its existence, but I think the theory that has the best explanatory power is that they lived there for a while and picked up some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another example of an Egypt sort of ism, I usually call them Egyptisms. This is in Genesis, but when God creates, how does he create? What is the mechanics that Genesis 1 gives us for how he creates? Like, what does the story tell us? Forget science or any of that. Just what's the text say?
He speaks.
He speaks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in Mesopotamia where a God speaks creation into existence. It's more violent. There's one where the most famous one is the god Marduk cuts a dragon in half. Right? It's like ancient anime.
Yeah.
He's an Avenger or something, right? But speaking is actually, if you think about it, a way more powerful way to do it to some extent. At any rate, but there is an Egyptian text where the god Ptah speaks things into existence.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, was that something they knew about too, or is that something the cultures have in common? So you got all these little weird things like that you're not 100% sure what to do with.
Right.
But there's Egyptisms back to the Exodus in the form of those words. And another one would be Moses' upbringing. All right, so you know the story, right? What happens? He's put in the basket, and then what?
Yeah, he floats down and then
he gets adopted.
Yeah, he gets adopted.
Yeah, not just by anybody.
Yeah, Pharaoh's folks.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, I understand the skeptic's initial read of that going, well, isn't that cute?
Yeah.
Too good to be true, right? I mean, come
Right.
on. Adopted by Pharaoh's daughter is one heck of a coincidence.
Or truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah, and so like there's parts of it that like seem to stretch modern reason or logic or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, and then he gets to grow up in the palace, even though a few verses back they're ready to try to kill all the boys. That seems incongruous, doesn't it? Like if we're just trying to
If
look
you're
at it
being a
without
cynic, yeah,
a
if you're
faith
looking-
community
yeah.
attached to it, you're just kind of like, what a powerful story. It's a little unrealistic is how it feels. But there was a policy already in place during that time period in Egypt, which is the New Kingdom, which just for quick dates, start to answer that question,
Yeah.
would be 1550 BC through about 1100, just to make the dates easy,
Yeah.
BC, and starting with the rule of at least that Moses III in the 1400s, like dead middle of the 1400s, they started bringing back to Egypt the sons of the local rulers that they had conquered. And they bring them back, put them in a nursery school system, so to speak, raise them up, Egyptianize them, teach them how to do all the things Egypt wants to do, like bureaucracy and writing and language and all the things, and then send them back when they're of age
Oh, wow.
to rule as vassals, right? So they still answer to Egypt, but the locals theoretically have less reason to rebel because it kind of feels like
Yeah.
one of their own is in charge, and the Egyptians get someone who knows
Yeah.
how they want to do everything.
Right.
So
So
actually,
it's not as far-fetched.
No, not a bit. Moses is just another little Semite, another to the Egyptians, someone who looks like a Canaanite.
Wow.
You know, the same kind of ethnicity. Or they're
I
all
wonder how
Semitic.
often you see that tactic in the ancient world. You know, it sounds like Babylon and the kind of bringing in Daniel and the best of their young
Yeah,
men.
they will.
That
They will,
kind of-
but they don't ever send them back to rule quite.
Yeah.
So Egyptians seem to have started this policy. But yeah, it's very clever.
Well, I will say this too, to put it into perspective. If Moses' mother is going to intentionally set him into a basket and send him downstream, I mean, I know moms. We all know moms. I'm trying to put a human element on this. I don't think they're haphazardly just going to go, "See you, buddy."
Yeah.
There's a very good chance. I've always thought that she was very well calculated in where that thing was going and who was going to be there when it got
And the
there.
midwives were already kind of
They're part of the
they're
thing.
part of the whole
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't think that just circumstance or just happenstance was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so
So
much
with
involved in
circumstantial evidence, we don't mean dumb luck.
that. Right. Right.
Yeah,
mean,
that's smart.
How
That's
did?
good.
Why is this in the text, or how did this work? And then we
Yeah.
contextualize it to Egypt. And we're like, hey, that's an Egyptian policy that could explain how Moses is allowed to grow up. And then he's also gets audiences with Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And then he's able to draw up a legal treaty between Yahweh and the people of Israel. How does he know all that?
Right.
He grew
He
up
was
learning
trained,
it.
yeah.
He was trained, and those
Right.
treaties actually fit that same window of time. There's a whole group of scholarship on the format of the covenant and what it's like. It's like a vassal treaty from
Wow.
the middle of the second millennium. So, like, that's what I mean by circumstantial evidence. I would love to have definitive proof, but I don't lie to people. And some of the people, perhaps well-meaning, perhaps not, such that I can't judge, but right, some people will extend the claim, and then well-meaning churchgoers buy the DVD. Again, whether it was deliberately deceitful, or not, it's still wrong with the data. And I think it's important that we as Christians can talk about this meaningfully and not embarrassingly,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's to a professor or anyone else. So then we get into other issues that there's a lot of context in Egypt for, but not, again, definitive proof. And I think some of that is almost philosophical and theological. So I don't have definitive proof of any of the 10 plagues. You can't, if we took the miraculous out of that, we've kind of hurt the text too much too.
Yeah.
However, the first several are very much at home in Egyptian geography. And there's been some scholarship, and I have an article on this in the Lipscomb Geographic Commentary series on the Pentateuch, talking about how the first 6 kind of like would be A leads to B leads to C,
Oh,
based
wow.
on the consequence of of the particular plague.
Yeah.
And then
what is it?
So like
Bulls,
Nile,
frogs,
you get the Nile turning red,
blood. Yeah.
frogs leave the river, kind of stuff. And scientists
Gnats
can
and
tell you that there
flies.
is a flagellate. It's called like a microorganism that occasionally in the Nile can appear, mostly upstream from Egypt, but in enough quantities to make it look reddish. But so most of these are actually not, I don't know, dragons and floating mountains, kind of fantasy. They're real world things at home in Egypt that happen either on a scale that's remarkable or, right, the perfect
the
timing.
Yeah.
And so the miracle doesn't always have to be, I don't know how to word it, that doesn't seem kind of goofy, but so supernatural. And the first 6 might be sort of a sequence, and then you get the next 3. They're not really sequential, but they're still real world things. The sun occasionally, very rarely, can be blotted out, right?
Yeah.
And then you get the 10th one, and I've got, okay, that's just full-on miracle, right? So like there's limits to what we can do with the historical method and with archaeological data, so we have to keep that in mind. And so the other 9 you can certainly talk about within a context in Egypt, and then the 10th is more unique. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if I can just touch base on that for a minute. So I think that so I started thinking about Sinai, and just reading a little bit in there, and the place where Moses goes up and the cloud of smoke comes around and they can't touch the mountain, and then there's smoke, and then there's the ground shaking, and everything that I heard in that sounded like a volcano,
Right.
Which so there was a part of me that goes, oh, so maybe God didn't cause this cloud of smoke and shake. Maybe it was a volcano, but then I go, wait a minute. That's a miracle too,
He's
right? Like
Lord of all creation, right?
Frogs are miracles. The stuff that turns the water red is a miracle, even if it's scientifically you're able to explain it.
And I think even if you think about something happening in your life that you think of as sort of a miracle or borderline miraculous or whatever, it's probably not something completely outrageous. It's probably I think it's more likely anyway that it would be something that happened just when you needed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? You didn't like jump 50 feet.
Yeah. Or
Somebody
like
had a
someone
rope,
pulling up your driveway and handing you a check, when you really need it, or you find one in your mailbox. You know.
Just something like
it's not
right when you need it. Yeah.
It's supernatural, and it's God intervening, but it's not this otherworldly.
And of course, as
fantasy.
a believer,
Yeah.
you will thank the person if you know who it is, but also ascribe it to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's how our biblical authors are, I think,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So the plagues kind of work that way.
How about that 10th one though?
That's fully unique.
Yeah.
And that's where it's like, okay, but there's never going to be historical archaeological data trying to lock in what happened with the 10th plague.
Yeah.
People don't record that. There's not going to be a wave of firstborn burials that they're like, oh yeah, we all died together.
Yeah,
they're
and
not.
to put it in reference,
And we don't know if they mean all of Egypt or just really the region they're in.
right? But to put it in reference, the 10th plague being the firstborn,
Yeah.
right? The killing of the firstborn.
Can you take us through the 10 plagues, just like naming them, just so we can remember from Sunday school?
Actually, what I think is most interesting about it, rather than just like which ones happen in what order, is the other thing I love to talk about with this is that there is literary structure to it. So if you pull it up on your Bible here, and you go ahead, find it, go ahead and grab it. You will see, and I'll do it on the app here. You will see that they are in we nerdily call it a tripartite structure, which just means cycles of 3. So if you look really, and you read it really carefully, and I'm always telling people, one of the first things to do is just read the Bible better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you read it carefully. I think you want to go to 7.
Yep, there it is.
And first plague, water turned to blood. And they continue the first 2 times in each cycle of 3, Pharaoh is warned. And then on the third cycle of the 3, he's not. And you just keep seeing this deliberate structure in the text. And then the 10th is its own thing again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you talk about like, oh, is God too harsh on the Egyptians or all these things? There were always these little markers in the text. And the reason these are important is they give you also some idea that maybe they're... So scholars had always, for 200 years, been trying to figure out what the sources behind the final form of the text are. And they would think, oh, this is a different source than that, and they'd break it into 5 verses, and then another 10 is a different source, and they splice it up. But I think this suggests unity in the author's point, because he goes, warned, warned, not warned. Warned, warned, not warned.
Yeah.
So that tells me it's somebody who's got deliberate design in how he phrases it. Okay, so then second is the frogs. Again, he'll be warned. I don't want to take time to read the whole thing.
No, it's good, man. Yeah, this is perfect.
Third is the gnats, then flies, right? And then it's either boils or the cattle. What is it? Livestock is fifth.
Yep.
And then boils is sixth. I always get those two mixed up in my head in the order.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get 7, 8, and 9, which don't go quite so sequentially. Again, that's one theory. We don't have to say it's 100%.
Right.
Which is hail, and then the people are stricken with locusts, right? Or the crops are stricken with locusts.
Right.
Which, by the way, if you've ever seen that, that is
I haven't seen it in
chaos personified, man.
Yeah.
That
Really?
is terrible devastation.
Just looks like
locusts are crazy.
a cloud.
Yeah, it's really,
Yeah.
really nasty business.
Wow.
And then you get the sky being dark, and then obviously the firstborn.
Yeah.
Was
So-
the 9th plague a no warning plague? Or,
It should be, yep.
Yeah.
And then there's other literary elements too, like where they're standing and whether they're before Pharaoh or it just happens. So like there are all these sort of opportunities Pharaoh has to relent. Of course, that's part of it too. And so I know everybody loves the plagues and like they're really interesting. And my kids are like, "Oh, we learned about the plagues today in church or whatever,"
Yeah.
because they're so. I mean, I don't mean this fictitiously, but they're the stuff of legend, right? Like
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
one of the things that sticks about the story for sure. And then you get these attempts to understand it by linking it to Egyptian gods. Like, oh, there's a goddess Hathor who's depicted as a cow a lot, so maybe this plague attacks livestock, or Ra and the darkness because he's the sun god.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think most of those work very well. The Ra one might, because Hathor was never... They didn't worship cows. Like, it's almost like bringing an aspect of like Hinduism
Right.
into Egypt, which
Right.
doesn't work. But they all attack the Pharaoh because he's supposed to, in the Egyptian worldview, uphold Ma'at, which basically means truth, justice in the Egyptian way, and order. So what are all the plagues demonstrating? Who orders the cosmos?
That God has control over the
God is the
Yeah.
one who has that,
Wow.
not Pharaoh. And so he's demonstrating, in an Egyptian context, the truth of the cosmos, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's another one I think that fits really good with this Egypt context that we've been talking about. Then there's another one I think that's really fun and interesting. This one's probably the most complicated one. I don't think we mentioned it last time. It's one of my favorites for sure. Does it ever just drive you crazy that Joseph, Exodus, either story, they don't just... The authors of the Bible don't just tell you who the Pharaoh is? It's like, you could just name him, right?
Yeah,
there
just tell
goes
us
the
exactly
chronology
where we are.
debate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, why isn't it named? Well, Joseph's a little trickier on this point, but I think it's basically the same idea. But it's very clear to me in the Exodus. Pharaoh's not named because he's the main character, Yahweh. He's Yahweh's enemy. And during the New Kingdom, the Egyptians have this sassy practice in their record keeping where they don't name Pharaoh's main enemy when they're off on a military campaign with his personal name. He's just the great chief. Usually he's the great, vile chief, or the cowardly chief, or whatever adjective they want to be sassy about. But it's never chief, and in the personal name.
Yeah.
And so Pharaoh is Pharaoh personal name, but the enemies don't get that level of respect. Right. And then later Egyptian texts will name them. And what's really crazy, bringing it back to the Bible, in the Exodus and Joseph narratives, the Bible seems to be doing the same thing to me. It's one of the most profound moments in Moses' life is Yahweh telling him, I am. Right? He's named
wow.
very, very, very explicitly, like very obviously. And Pharaoh is just Pharaoh. And then later in the Bible, Josiah, for example, dies fighting Pharaoh Necho. And the Bible's giving you the specific name of the enemy later. So in both cases, the biblical authors are following the Egyptian way to name the enemy. And then the question, this is why it's circumstantial evidence that I love, why would the biblical authors follow the earlier Egyptian New Kingdom practice if they were making the whole thing up much later? But is there a biblical source that might have been in Egypt that picked up that way of doing things at some point? If you think there's a historical Moses and he grows up in the palace learning the Egyptian way to do things, it actually contextualizes why Pharaoh's not named.
Yeah.
And it also helps with our historicity because there's only that window of time where they do it that way.
Love that, man.
So it's a complicated one, but it's really cool.
No,
Yeah.
I love that the focus too is not just on, where can we find the wagon wheels and where's the wood from the ark.
Yeah, we don't need to do that.
Like we don't there's so much more of this evidence that almost has like these deeper roots in how was this infused into the culture.
Somewhat, yes. But what I'm really trying to do right now is a combo of things. But mostly what I'm doing is I'm just trying to point out stuff in the Bible.
Yeah.
I'm not traipsing around Saudi Arabia. We don't need to. And then obviously some background knowledge of Egypt, which, that's why I'm here, right?
Right.
But so that's not something everyone has, but you can get the ESV study Bible. They have an archaeology study Bible for like $25.
Yeah, man.
It'll have little box write-ups on all this stuff and good notes.
Put
it's
that
an
on your
awesome
birthday
resource.
list.
Yep.
Yeah, man.
Cool.
I didn't contribute to it, but my two colleagues at Lipscomb did.
Oh, really?
Right, big chunks of it. It's awesome. I've given it to Tate, small group leader.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something for the audience to think about if they want more in a way that's, reader friendly for people who already love the Bible. Okay. Now, Aubrey, I'm going to put you on the spot one more time with the Bible. I know you got something you want to read.
All right,
First, you're going to read
man,
something
good.
for me, all right?
I'll read it, man.
Exodus 1:11.
1:11. Here it comes, man. Let me get there. I kept my finger in it because I knew you were going to do this.
You got it out. It's perfect.
All right, Exodus 1, verse 11. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses.
Yep, that'll work.
All right.
It's good enough.
There it is.
The store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, this is actually the best piece of quote evidence we have. That reference to Ramses, a town, a store city, whatever that means. And this translation is pretty standard, but most scholars that deal with Egyptian, such as me, and hieroglyphs, and then Hebrew, or at least deal with Egypt and then Hebrew, would say, well, there's not really a word for like storage installation from what we can tell in Hebrew. It's the same word, ir, as the word for city. So it's not likely that they're building the whole city, but that they're building almost like a little bit out of time, but basic idea is almost like a silo.
That's what I was
attached
thinking
to, because we know the Egyptians do this. They have all these grain storage silo-ish buildings attached to palaces and temples, because those are the main hubs of the economy.
Right.
And you come into temple and get your
That's the
grain
currency
rations and stuff like that. So that's probably what they're actually building. But what's really cool about that reference is Ramses is known as the city Pi-Ramses in Egyptian texts. And that was built in the Delta, which is right where the land of Goshen would be, where the Israelites would be. And it would have been built by either Seti I or his son, Ramses the Great. Probably started by Seti and finished by Ramses.
Seti?
Seti, S-E-T-I or Y.
Okay.
And then Ramses II / Ramses the Great. Right.
And
Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments, Ramses the Great.
Right, I was going to say.
Pharaoh in the Prince of Egypt.
And this information obviously comes not just from biblical stuff.
Yeah, now
this comes from
back
Egyptian.
to my Egyptian data.
Right.
But the Bible's telling us about this specific thing, so we're tying them together. So
Yeah, that's cool.
I haven't jumped off from the Bible at all. We've
Love
just
it.
brought in info to it. And also, for the record, Prince of Egypt is your most accurate Hollywood depiction of the
Really?
Exodus. Yeah.
Oh, wow. All right.
Okay.
The cartoon does pretty well.
Good job, Prince of Egypt.
Yeah, it's just kind of fun. So Pi-Ramses was started and then lasted only about 150 years. I'll give you the full dates in a second. because the branch of the Nile that it was built on actually dries up. Like it's silted up. And so your splendid Egyptian northern capital, if you think of Egypt as north and south, essentially, the Ramses family is from that region. So they built this awesome new city to rule that part of Egypt from. And then the Nile branch that it was on dried up. Well, your splendid capital-ish city is no longer splendid if it doesn't have any
a
water.
source of water, right?
And you've got the Nile everywhere else, right?
Right.
So they move it. They're good little recyclers. And the Egyptians reuse the blocks 10 miles north.
They do. Wow.
Yeah.
Is there evidence of the old?
Yeah, we're getting there. You are right. Yep, you got it.
Go
Love
ahead,
that you
G.
can anticipate
Hennessy,
that.
man. Look at those
You see
brains.
that history major turn.
Yeah, that's right.
So, for a long time, scholars thought, I'm talking till the early 1900s, 1950s for sure, we knew better by then, but they thought Pi-Ramses was basically just biblical Tanis. You'll see the city Tanis in like the Psalms, also called Zoan.
Okay.
And in Psalms 78 and 105, which both reference the Exodus, they refer to it as Tanis. Right. And of course, poetic license kind of plays into some of that too. You guys, you're musicians, you know that.
Yeah.
Right. They've got their reasons to do things in a liturgical sense in some of the Psalms references. At any rate, because by the time the psalmist writes, it was moved to Tanis. So for all it's basically Tanis. Okay, but archaeology comes into play here because they found the very small amount of foundation stones at Pi-Ramses and have since excavated it, and now they found that the site is like 20 hectares, which is basically enough to support maybe 40,000 people.
Whoa.
And they don't have very many stones or like architectural remains. It's a very unique site because they reuse the blocks.
Yeah.
But they do have a bunch of what we call small finds, and a lot of them are associated with weaponry and chariots. So it's like a chariot garrison attached there. Of course, if you're going north out of Egypt, you got to have a base kind of right there too, and they've got forts elsewhere. But this site is very well attested archaeologically as Pi-Ramses. So archaeology can confirm that the city was really there for that narrow use of time is basically what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
So from about 1280 to at most something like 1130 BC. If the Israelites are making the whole thing up way later, or even just a couple centuries later, you have to either say they've got incredible sources on this Egyptian
history
factor, or they were there and knew the name and get it right.
Wow.
Because the later biblical texts actually call it the new city's name, but Exodus uses the first name. That strongly suggests to me, Jim Hoffmeyer and a few others, several others I guess, that they were there at that time. And this is actually the best piece of data we have. Because it's a combination of understanding the text and hard archaeological data. And then it gets at the date. Because if that city is an authentic reference, well, there's your window.
Right.
It's not earlier, like some well-meaning Christians believe. It's the late date, which is more like the consensus date. And that would be middle of Ramses' reign.
Right.
Maybe early-ish, but... Okay, and then his son and successor, Merneptah, I think we mentioned this last time.
Yeah.
He references Israel in Canaan in 1208. So if they leave under his dad, who rules for 66, 67 years, they do the wandering. By the time Merneptah gets up there, he runs into him and comes back to Egypt. That all kind of fits broadly. And it's way more technical than that, to be honest, but I think that'll work for what we want to convey. So that's why I think it's historical.
I love that.
Yep. There's one elephant in the room. Told you this answer could be the whole episode.
I like it.
Last thing I'll mention before you ask me more. The number of people.
Yeah.
So in in Numbers, the book of Numbers, we get the census data, right? And it's like 600,000, whatever. Okay, that's pretty tough to accept at face value. How many women and children combined with the 600,000? What's the total population then? A couple million?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. There are pretty strong studies on the attempting, it's not really census data like a Roman census, but trying to get at the idea of how many people lived in Egypt at the time, and they come up with basically 2 to 3 million. And the Israelites are just in the Delta, and there's almost that many of them.
But I will say, though, that Pharaoh's saying in the first part
They
of
are
Exodus,
numerous.
like, he's like, man, they're getting out of control here.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's certainly possible.
Right.
But the number is very hard to wrap your head around based on everything else we know archaeologically about settlements, settlement patterns, the size of settlements, population estimates. And you could probably argue they could maybe take over Egypt. A foreign group had done that before.
And that's kind of what he was saying. Is
He's worried about that happening twice. But the real problem with that number is they wouldn't have any trouble at all in Canaan. Okay, so now we got to figure out this issue. Well, the Hebrew term that we translate 1,000 there is Eleph, which is one of its meanings is 1,000. But it can also mean a military unit, basically, or a leader. And so if it means one of those things, then you still have a ton of Israelites, enough to be bothering Pharaoh, but not so much as to be impossible. So it's probably a translational issue, and I know that some people don't like to hear that. That's why it's good to know the original language. Our Bibles aren't infallibly translated. Most of the time we know it, right? Like it's probably 99%. But there are times where like, actually this right here has some options.
You just opened up a whole nother episode.
I
did,
man.
right there.
And I can explain this best by going to a verse in Joshua.
Yeah.
So after they take Jericho, you know where they go next? It's their big loss.
AI?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at AI, or pronounced I, either one, either both fine, they suffer this huge defeat. And the text makes it pretty clear that they're devastated by this. And of course, theologically, what's the reason?
They went without the
sin.
Achan's
he
sin.
screwed up the commands after they conquered
yeah.
Jericho. Right? He didn't devote things to the Lord, basically.
Is
So
that
they
the
deal
one
with
where
that.
they took this? He took the stuff and
yeah.
didn't. Right.
He wasn't supposed to.
Right.
And then they deal with that. They go back and they defeat Ai. In the middle of all that, the verse that recaps the battle at Ai is like, I think it's 29 out of 60,000, out of 60 Eleph. And that's a devastating defeat. Just 29. I'm sorry, but mathematically, let's just be honest here.
Yeah.
In what world is 29 out of 60,000 at all devastating?
Yeah.
But what if it's 29 out of 60 and it's one of the other meanings of Aleph?
1,000.
60
Not
leaders.
1,000, 60 leaders.
Oh,
or
yeah.
60 units.
Yeah.
A group of 20 fighting men, you know.
Right.
Well, now it's almost half.
Yeah,
Now
that's a
that
big
would
deal.
definitely be devastating.
Yeah.
So there are other verses that suggest to scholars that look into this that Aleph might need to be translated that way.
Wow.
And it's kind of like a homonym. And the native audience would have been like, oh, they mean this one, not 1,000.
They would have
Kinda
understood the context.
Yeah, from their own culture and the context, they would have known right away which one. But by the time we're trying to translate it, I think we get it a tick off. Almost like the English word bark, right? Everybody listening to me will know from context if it's the sound a dog makes or the stuff on the outside of a tree.
Yeah.
Or, spelled with a Q, a sacred boat. So I was telling him about how my dogs are barking at the knock on the door the other day when I was recording in a different context, and I didn't go check it. I just muted while my partner was talking, right? And then I get up and the door's actually half open, and I'm like, oh, they were like extra freaking out that day. And so they were barking like crazy. You already know I'm not talking about them throwing the exterior of a tree at the door. That's how Eleph would kind of work with those other translational options. And in the Israelite context, they wouldn't have messed it up.
I even think about the word, like, if we use a bunch, you know, a bunch of these guys.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Lord, that could mean a whole lot of things. Or it could mean an actual handful of something, or, you know, or it could mean thousands.
Yeah. So there's, in English, every language has words that work that way.
Yeah.
And in this one, it's pretty, for the Joshua example, it seems pretty clear to me anyway, that 1,000 is probably not the best translation. Now, a thorough Bible might even note this stuff for you, but it's certainly an issue that we don't do enough in our Bibles to explain this, because I think people get all worked up like I'm saying the Bible's wrong. I'm saying we're wrong about the Bible, or we're not thinking through the options, maybe. Same thing with the Red Sea. It's not the Red Sea in Hebrew. It's the Sea of Reeds.
Oh, right.
And the irony there is just how similar even those words look in English. Right?
Red and reeds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the whole area from the Mediterranean down to the Red Sea was marshy during the New Kingdom, which is when the Exodus is. And so they call it the Sea of Reeds. That means that basically just that region. So if you're with, let's say it's 30,000, 40,000, whatever, based on my understanding of Aleph, we take that number down a bit of the total population of the Israelites. Still enough to be a majorly large group in the small area, relatively speaking, like the Delta. So Pharaoh is still concerned.
Yeah, as many as the population.
Right. But you're trying to get out of there, maybe even suspecting Pharaoh's going to change his mind, as readers know he does.
Yeah.
And then you reach a body of water that's not the full-on sea, but it's still deep enough that you can't just cross it. You still need a miracle.
Yeah.
We're not removing the miracle, but we are getting better now at this Egyptological data and translating it better, knowing where to look. There's a couple lakes in that region that are basically, well, they're not entirely dried up today, but they would have been bigger then and chained to more water because it's drier now than it was. And they still need that miracle. And then the Greek translation of the Old Testament calls it Red Sea, and that just sticks down to present. But in the actual Hebrew, it's Sea of Reeds. And that word reeds is another borrowed Egyptian word.
Oh, man.
But are you saying that in that context that maybe it wasn't the Red Sea, it was something, or that's just you're saying?
It's a region. It's like a regional term.
Yeah.
So it'd be like saying they crossed the Great Lakes.
Could have been one of
a couple.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not the Atlantic.
Yeah.
However, and this is where my analogy breaks down, the Sea of Reeds region would have contained the northern part of the Red Sea. There's like a ton to this whole conversation.
Right.
That's why I've got a whole other book I'm writing with my friend Chris on the geography and all the terms.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's its own book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Sea of Reeds is a huge chunk of it, right? But this is not the Bible being wrong again. It's that we need to be more nuanced in how we translate it and more consistent to the original Hebrew.
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh, there's still lakes there. They still need the same basic miracle. And the reason I bring this up is, now why would we look for chariots in the Red Sea?
Mm-hmm.
And since it's not the sea, and it does dry up some, the Egyptians can recycle some of that, whatever they would have lost. They could have gotten some of it out,
Yeah.
versus in the sea where they wouldn't be able to.
That's
Plus,
interesting.
Being wet, they wouldn't have maybe survived today anyway.
Yeah.
So all that's just hokey stuff with the wheels.
It is, but it's interesting that we went from talking about whether they're actually there or not, and that it turns our attention to whether there is where they would actually be.
And that's
or
what
not.
I love about doing it with this way, with the context of
Yeah.
Egypt in mind, and then a really careful reading of the biblical text.
Yeah.
My same mentor, Jim Hoffmeyer, that I mentioned earlier, he told me a story of years and years ago where he was at a church giving a talk on some of this stuff, like with slides and everything, which it is. That's the trickiest thing about this format. What I really want is to be able to show you on maps, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I do that with the students. But, he finishes up, and the older guy stands up. He's like, "You mean to tell me there was no miracle at the Red Sea? Walls of water and all?" And he's like, "Well, there's still a miracle. It's just not there." Like, this guy was like, he's upset that he thought he kind of lost this miracle he grew up with. Different old guy stands up, and he says, "You mean to tell me God is so amazing he can drown Pharaoh's army in a little puddle of water?" And Jim jokes, that guy had his miracle either way. Of course, he didn't say it was ever a small puddle. Like I keep saying, it's more like a lake-ish size, right? But it was just funny the way people react to new information. So,
Yeah.
Why does it matter then? Like what you're explaining has it to me like more studied fact, but it's not near as exciting as the thought that they have found the exact spot where the sea parted, and all of the like the rock and the sand is a different color because of this supernatural thing,
which you actually get all over Sinai too, by the way.
Yeah.
That darkened rock because of the theophany.
Why? I guess what I could do in this situation then is turn it around to why do we care? Not why do we care what you're saying. Why do we get so deeply
I see.
enthralled in trying to come up with, like, if you see a post, let's say just an innocent bystander sees a post and they're like, we have found.
Yeah, they don't know it's
And
bogus.
this feeling that you get when you're that person, why do we care about that?
Yeah, man, that's a good question.
I mean, I don't know if that's relevant.
It's very relevant.
I think it is for sure. And I think it's part of my anecdote with my dad.
Yeah.
He was an engineer, right? He's a man of science on many levels. And it seemed like he wanted something to come alongside to help him believe more, perhaps. Right? And why do we sometimes feel that need?
To put this into context with what you're saying, I think that people might get their feathers ruffled, right? Because they believe this thing, and I might be one of them. They believe this thing because that's what it says, and that's what I'm going to stick to. And then if you say something that would lead maybe a different direction than where my mind thinks that this thing went.
Or you've been taught that it went.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or that your great-great-great-grandparents were taught that it went too.
Yeah.
Then I'm mad now.
That does happen.
Yeah. But then again, it brings me back around to the point of, like, well, okay, we don't know Pharaoh's, like, which one, exactly. The text may not tell us.
Yeah.
But I almost feel like it comes back around to the divinity of the word, where God is saying he could have made anything he wanted in this book. He could have let us know the detailed dates and the people and the times. But then how does faith fall into that?
Yeah, man.
And so balance, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah,
right?
I think that. I guess I was kind of trying to lead with that a little bit, like another way that scholars will often put it, that are Christians, is that we have a reasonable faith. God doesn't expect us to believe in the ridiculous or the absurd, and not very often anyway. You could argue the resurrection's the hardest thing, except scientifically, I guess. In that sense, there are still miracles that just require faith, and obviously there's not one more important than that one. So we don't bypass faith, and we don't get to rationalize away all of it, but we do get to make cases for plausibility. And I think part of that matters because it helps us defend the truth of it. Because the Bible itself doesn't present this like it's just a faith claim. This is a history of the people, and more importantly, the history of God's redemptive plan. Because the one thing we haven't talked enough about in this, because it doesn't touch on the history and archaeology that I specialize in as much, though we did a little bit mention it, is the covenant itself. And the whole point of wandering around in the wilderness is to get rid of the generation that's not keeping it for anything. Right? So that's not just, well, God said it and that's good enough for me. It is trying to put its story, its narrative, and I don't mean fictional sense there, but in the real world, in a specific time and place with a specific people that then develop into the next phase, taking the land. And the next phase, maybe you'd call that the Davidic covenant after that, right? All building toward what?
Jesus.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
So the historical part of this is not a throwaway. That's why it matters.
Yeah.
And when I can help you with some of the details, I hope that value is clear, because we're talking about the redemptive history as people of faith.
Yeah.
And I can't help you much with the 10th plague. And I think that's back to your balance. Because God wants us to realize, hey, there is real data here. I'm not making it up and asking you to believe it, but I'm not going to give you everything.
Yeah.
But you work hard enough, maybe you can figure out what the deal with that pharaonic name is.
Yeah, right.
So he rewards the curious and the detailed researcher, but you never get to be free of the need for faith. Does that make sense?
100%. I love how what you're doing is honoring what God created in us, in this curiosity and this intellect that we have, that we come to faith in the Lord and we come before him and before his word with an intellectual honesty, not faith requiring us to leave all that at the door.
Right.
And I think it also helps us in our desire to reach others with this message and to tell these stories, because not that we're trying to prove intellectually that Jesus can transform your life supernaturally, But at the same time, we're also not avoiding that.
Yeah.
You know? And the more we dig into it, even just the stuff that you've talked about today makes me go, golly, the connections that God made here, like even that little thing you mentioned about the covenant kind of having these pieces of ancient Egyptian, you know, form and stuff, and how, man, God had that even in his mind as he was thinking about forming Israel's covenant. And
one of the other takeaways on that point is Moses isn't too good to be true. He's borderline perfectly trained for it.
Yeah,
which is pretty crazy, man. So I think it's like encouraging, but I don't think it removes faith. But even as you were talking too, like the other thing that I think about all this, I think we touched on this last time, but it's obviously, I think, one of the most important things to reiterate. This whole process I'm trying to walk through with you guys, and yeah, I have the data, but I hope you understand the approach, right? Like the method, the reason behind the method, all of that. Like, let's read the Bible carefully. Let's look at the background data and all that. What else could loving the Lord your mind, with your mind, be about?
Yeah.
And that's the part of that, what command is the greatest answer that Jesus gives. That if we're really honest, now we were going to step on some toes.
Yeah.
Our churches stink at.
Yeah.
We don't do this.
Now,
our sermons basically don't do this.
You're talking
throughout
about
my lifetime.
Love the Lord with your mind.
Yep. We don't do much of this. Love our church now. I'm not trying to throw shade at them. I'm talking my whole life, but it's been literally every church, small groups. Well, to me, this verse means,
right.
Mine doesn't do that much.
Well, I
try to be nice about it, but it's like, hang on, let's figure out what it really meant.
But
we can expect more of people.
Yeah.
Especially our young people, man. They can play all kinds of complex, crazy video games.
They actually long for more
They
of that.
do all sorts of crazy stuff with math. They do. I think they're hungry for it. So let's do it.
But I've got to rebuttal a little bit. And I agree with what you're saying, because in the culture that we're in now. But if you look back through the centuries, like, there were a lot of people in this country, as a matter of fact, that didn't quite have the time to really dig the mind part into this thing, because they had to survive.
It's hard.
And it's almost like, and God tells us that the meek will inherit the earth, or, Jesus said, the first shall be last, that kind of stuff. Like, as much as we now have, and thank God we live in a country where we have the ability to stretch the mind part of the thing.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think for many centuries and for many cultures, they didn't get the opportunity to do that, and God could most certainly work within that group, because all they had to do was trust in Him
absolutely.
to provide and survive,
Yeah.
So I do think balance comes back
again,
into
for
it.
sure. And I think it's not like you're in sin if you're not doing this or something.
Right.
But it's like, now that we have the tools and we have some of the knowledge,
Now,
I'd love for us to do it more.
right,
Yeah.
I agree.
On Sunday. But I realize, too, to be fair, you're also have to consider, like, who the general audience is,
You
what
have
they're
to.
ready for. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
maybe from the pulpit seems like a bit of a stretch, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you might lose people pretty quick who aren't. It's all too new. And, like, this
Man.
is a good format because they can rewind.
Yeah.
We can go back. We can finish the episode later. There's issues with a live sermon that can't always do. Certainly not all of this. So there is definitely balance.
I'll always turn
aware.
this stuff back into music reference, and it's like, there's a reason that jazz is not on every radio station.
Why you guys know this? Why are, I don't know what key, G or C? Why are so many worship songs in the similar keys?
Yeah.
And how many of them are anything but 4/4 time?
Yeah. A few,
Why? Because you can't play it. That's not why.
Well, you throw a band together.
Hey, man.
You throw a band together in a couple days, maybe that's why. But also people can keep up better.
Yeah.
Congregationally.
It's what
So we have to
they've
keep
come
all
to
that in
expect
mind.
and
Definitely.
You do.
Really, who I'm chiding as much as anybody here are scholars like me who are believers, who don't do any of this kind of stuff.
There's our guy.
Because if Pastor Aaron's here, I believe he's like, I need to learn this too. Wow. Because when I talk to him about it, he eats it up.
Yeah.
So it's like, as much as anything, the ivory tower is the problem.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to chide our pastors, but I would love our churches to dive into this more. That's why I put together the 5 views of the Exodus book. I was trying to get it.
The 5 E's of the Exodus.
5 views.
5 views of the
Yeah,
Exodus.
I was trying to get that info to interested, educated, basically, non-specialists, but people like rabbis and pastors and people like you guys who are just interested in the topic.
Is that where can we find that?
It's online. It's on Amazon and everywhere.
Okay.
Yep.
The 5 Views of the Exodus
So,
by
I don't mean to
Dr.
plug
Mark
the book,
Janzen. Hey, I'm
but I
plugging
edited
it for you.
We're about to anyway.
So I edited it, and invited the scholars that wrote the chapters, like I do the intro and the conclusion, and moderate their debate.
That's cool.
So then you get the different views in a chapter, with the author, right, writes his main view, the other 4 critique it, and then he has the final say in that chapter, and then we go on to the next view.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
So,
man, I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah,
man.
I was going to say, too, while you're looking that up, I wanted to just do a quick plug that we've got a friend here who has a book that's out in the world right now. And,
Yeah, man.
How's it going?
It's going great, man.
Yeah.
The books.
You're doing the...
I'm doing the audio book, man.
You're reading
Nice.
the audio
Yeah,
book thing,
I
right?
did. I just recorded
You
it
did?
last week, man. So now the real work begins in the editing of all my mistakes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Shoot, that takes a while.
Yeah, man.
Well, this is the
Yeah,
moment.
man.
Now, come on.
Filter the noise.
There you go.
How to hear God's
Love that
voice in a
title.
culture of chaos. Just helping people, give them tools to, embody that scripture that says, we take captive our thoughts and make them obedient to Christ. And just, I think especially for men around a table, man, we live in our heads so much.
Oh, for
and
sure.
we
Yeah.
we live and die by the voices that we listen to, and most of them don't come from the outside. They're inside here.
Yeah, for sure.
And how do we get ourselves in the best possible position on a regular basis to hear the words and the voice of the Lord versus living by the voices of the lies or the anxiousness or all these things. So
Yeah.
my hope is that when people read the book, that they feel equipped, not necessarily to check off another box and be like, God, look what I did, but more of like, how can we be found listening,
Mm-hmm.
and in that place of listening be as quiet in our minds as possible to be able to elevate and sensitize our ears to the voice of the Lord.
Yeah.
So, hey man, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, man, and I think it's interesting that it's called Filter the Noise, and you're doing an audio version of it. Just,
I know.
you're throwing
I know.
noise out there. But now you guys I need to write a book, I guess, man.
You gotta catch up.
man.
I got to get on the ball.
Dude, 5 Views of the Exodus.
Yep.
Are you going to do an audiobook anytime soon, man?
They discussed it, but it's been pretty tricky to figure out how, since
Oh, because there's different voices,
Yeah.
right?
I don't know if everyone wants to or how it would even be as a...
Bring them all into Miss Judy.
Yeah,
here,
let's
man.
go, baby. We got the microphones.
There you go. But it's funny you mentioned the noise, and it makes me think as a historian, more like generally, maybe we're back in your wheelhouse here, but we've as a sort of almost as a species conquered so many of the problems that ancients were, for obvious reason, obsessed with. And I don't mean to be crass, but like fertility,
Yeah.
infant mortality rates. There's a reason they do all these weird things to try to conceive a child and protect the home and bury little statues under the doorway to scare off the demons that they
Yeah.
think are killing
Yeah.
the kids. And like, if you can get a kid to 5, it's a whole different thing, or even 2. But the infant mortality rate is like 50%.
Wow.
Can you just imagine the psychology of living that?
Yeah.
And they're living off the land, and it's a more simplistic, rustic lifestyle, and all these things. People kind of romance some of that, but it's like their noise is just like trying to survive in some respects. And now, I mean, obviously, there's still people that, I'm not trying to minimize people who have miscarriages or anything like that, but
Yeah.
we've largely solved, to a certain extent, greatly solved
Percentage-wise, yeah.
the math on that. I mean, my middle child would have had pneumonia and died in the ancient world.
Wow.
She had
Yeah.
fluid in her lungs.
Yep.
And yeah, we had to put her in NICU, and we couldn't hold her for 9 days, and that part stunk. But I didn't really ever consider that she wouldn't make it,
Sure.
because I was like, oh, I know the doctors know this.
Or our wives.
right? And our
Men-
wives,
Oh,
you know.
yeah.
Few
I
of
mean,
our
anyone who has a
yeah.
C-section today, baby might make it. The mom probably doesn't. In the ancient
Yeah.
world, breech births, whatever else.
Yeah, how about that?
So now our noise is like stupid TV and
Yeah.
podcasts.
Or
so they're great, right? And
advertisements, yeah.
sometimes they're the wrong message depending on who you're listening to,
Yeah.
right? All the ads, all the keeping up with the Joneses and comparisons, and all of a sudden we're miserable. It's like, man, our lives materially are crazy spoiled compared to people in the past.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
but we
man.
still have the mental health crisis
Yeah.
Yeah.
because the noise. I think that's
Yeah, man.
That's what your title makes me think about.
Because it's the noise that's within, man. That, you know, one of the things I say in the book is like, you can go to the farthest reaches of the earth, to the most remote places, and still never escape the noise inside your own mind and heart, you know. But that's what the Lord gives us.
Yeah.
That's why he says that he himself is our peace, you know. Like he and his presence goes with us. He is with us everywhere, you know.
Yeah.
Never leaves us. And that's why we even have the potential, the opportunity to be at peace, even in the middle of the chaos, you know. So, yeah, man, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
It's really...
And I think about, like, Matthew 6, where he's like, do not worry about your life. And then think about the things he talks about worrying about. By way of analogy, it's like eating. The birds eat. And they have
what you're going to wear.
What you're going to wear. It's like, I don't, for a single day, a minute of any day, go, am I eating today?
Right. Yeah.
It's what am I eating? How much? Should I eat healthier? There's a lot of other
Should
questions.
I eat less?
But we worry about totally, like, secondary things compared to what he's even referencing. Like, can you imagine living in a world it's like, I gotta worry about this, and we'll like worry about, I don't know, a credit card statement or whatever else. It's like we still have our needs met, and it's still impossible not to worry.
Yeah.
Like, it's a timeless message.
Yeah, it is.
It is. I think about that a lot, and like who was the crowd he was talking to in that moment, you know, and what were they
That's
concerned
context.
about?
See, you're doing it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And yeah, they might have been like, where we gonna? Which I'm gonna open up a whole thing, but the Israelites were doing the same thing, right? Like,
what are we going to eat?
We're thirsty. I went back through and checked, you know, dug back into Exodus a little bit, and the fact that they were so often going, we're thirsty, man. What's the deal? And it's interesting that for years, this is the living word happening. For years, I thought, man, they just got guided through the sea that opened up, and they walked through it, and now they're complaining again like they didn't. But then it hit me today, something I never thought about. They were thirsty, and they said, Moses, what's up, man? We're thirsty. I mean, I know we just got through the plagues and through the sea and all that stuff, but we're thirsty. So I always thought, why are they being so, you know, pushy?
Yeah.
But then I realized that Moses goes, God, man, they're thirsty. And God goes, well, go over and touch the rock and some water will come out of it. Why didn't he do it without him asking? Like, it's almost like he was waiting for him to ask for something, and then they did, and he gave it to him. Instead of all those years, I thought, they're being pushy. He's going to take care of them. Well, it's kind of like he didn't take care of them until they asked for it. It's pretty interesting to me. I went way off subject of Matthew 6.
And then you get Moses getting in trouble for doing it the second time when he was supposed to speak to it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's always bothered people over the years. But there's a reason for that, too, actually.
Wow.
So Bedouin, today even, can actually draw water from the rocks in Sinai because there's a certain kind of rock that will absorb the moisture and store it. And it's like a trick if you know the geography really well.
Huh.
But so that was God kind of teaching them the first time.
Yeah.
Here's the deal. And then when Moses does it that way, what's he doing? Like, why is God so irritated so much about that Moses himself doesn't get to the promised land? I used to always think that was like kind of too harsh.
Yeah.
That's
Like, if
what
I'm honest, I'm like, I know, Lord,
golly.
I shouldn't do this, but what's the deal?
Yeah.
Well, because Moses was doing it now the new sort of man-centric way, and God wanted the people to know.
He figured out I can do this without you, God.
Yeah, and God wanted them to see that it was still him providing it, presumably.
Wow.
So, like, even some of that kind of thing really makes you think.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, the trust, right? Like, I mean, we all do this in our lives at various points where we, like, might catastrophize the future, right? It's like, what bad thing might happen?
Worst case scenario.
Yeah, well, why are you thinking that?
Yeah.
I have to stop myself. It's not like anyone's got this mastered, but
Man.
because we listen to the wrong voices, right?
Yep.
We have to learn how to filter the noise.
That's right.
Yeah.
Look at y'all, man. It's available on Amazon.
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, where's yours available?
Yeah, man.
All right, so off rant.
Yeah, man.
One other thing that was talked a lot about in Exodus was the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, yeah.
And, man, I just got to know where it is. So while we cannot continue this today, it only begs that we should get back together again and talk.
I should try to set this up where we Zoom my buddy.
Okay,
But I
done
don't
deal.
know.
Where is he?
He's in Corpus Christi, Texas.
Well, I mean, y'all jump
Hey,
in
man,
Judy, and
let's
we're
go.
going to go to Texas.
This
you
maybe
go.
is a mobile
Yeah.
recording studio for one
Nah,
reason.
if we let's set it up to where we can make that work, because I'll figure it out.
Okay.
Judy has the capability, I believe.
Yeah, man.
So yeah, we'll talk more about that.
He's just made a documentary. It's not out yet.
Oh yeah,
It's good on the Ark of the Covenant.
nice.
What?
Yeah.
Dude, I'm
Okay,
pumped.
done deal.
I'm so pumped.
And
Well, he can
We'll
fly
see.
to Nashville, can he?
we could probably fly him in at some point.
Yeah, we could. Yeah,
I mean, that's your call, I guess.
done deal, man. We're gonna make it happen. We're gonna talk about that. I don't know about 4. We'll have to figure out if I
Yeah,
got.
man,
I only
what-
got 3 seats.
Yeah.
We'll have to
Hey,
figure
man,
this out.
I'll
We'll
give
make it
him
work.
my seat, man. That's
There's another one over there. We'll figure it out. Hey, listen, guys. Thank you so much for. And I don't want to. If you got something else, I
No,
don't.
I mean, mine was just Hebrews 11:29 says, "By faith the people crossed the Red Sea and as on dry land." I just think that was all this is we're talking about. It's just, it still comes down to faith, man.
By faith.
I mean, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden. You know, all of this is just pointing us toward this greater trust in the Lord. All this evidence is all still going to build up to. There's going to be a gap between what we know and what
At some point, we reach the limit.
and what we trust about God. You know, and even Moses, man, even Moses' mom.
But I think it's great for those of us who weren't there to
Yeah.
see it.
Yeah,
To be like, okay, this makes more sense than the skeptics might
yeah,
lead you to believe.
I love it.
Right on.
Let's do it.
Excited. All right, Mark. Thank you, Dr. Mark. Professor McGowan. Thank you
Oh,
so
I'm a
much.
professor now. Woo.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Man,
And guys, till we see you again and talk to you again, get out your Bible, open up your mind, put on your armor. God bless you. All right, guys. That was Dr. Mark Janzen and my buddy Professor Aubrey McGowan on Fully Armed talking about the Exodus. Man, that was so fun and so insightful. He is just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to that stuff. So thanks for checking it out. Thanks for hanging with us. Be on the lookout for us talking about the Ark of the Covenant. We hope that all comes together at some point. Until that point, you guys put on your armor. Thank you for hanging out with us on Fully Armed. God bless you. That's God bless you.